Hi, welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. Peter Singer is one of the foremost philosophers of our time, and I'm really happy he agreed to spend time with me in a fascinating dialogue for this week's podcast. I had the opportunity a number of years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, to appear with Peter on stage, and that appearance changed the way I thought about the world. And so I was really happy to be able to have him back, specifically on the republication of his famous book. The 1975 book, Animal Liberation, has been rewritten substantially by Peter, and it's called Animal Liberation Now. And I want to spend time talking about that. Peter was one of the first people to make popular the idea that animals other than human beings have rights, particularly the rights not to suffer. And equal consideration of interests, as he called it, should be applied to the entire animal kingdom, if possible. And he lives by the way he speaks. He's a vegetarian and a vegan. And I remember his discussions of factory farming, of chickens and meat, even back then years ago, was enough to make me rethink the way I ate. It took me a while, but I'm happy to say that now I'm a vegetarian. And again, he talks about in the new book and in our discussion the fact that factory farming hasn't really changed, and even though I live surrounded by the sea, what I hadn't realized was that fishing of fish actually also not only causes trauma for the fish in an obvious way, but maybe more than obvious when you think about factory farming of fish, but takes resources. For example, the fact that salmon have to be fed fish, farmed salmon have to be fed fish that could otherwise feed other people. And of course, now the question of climate change has become very important. So we talked about all of these things and more. I wanted to, as I do in Origins podcast, to talk about Peter's origins and what got him into philosophy in the first place. And he's a remarkable human being, and it's a wonderful discussion. He's passionate about these ideas, and will confront some of the ideas you may have about animal rights, in fact, and animal sentience. And I hope get you thinking at least about the way you deal with the world. In addition, of course, to his work on animal liberation, he's written seminal books on effective altruism, on how to most effectively do good in the world. And again, he lives by that, giving a significant fraction of his own salary to effective charitable causes. And we talked about that discussion. I think listening to the discussion with Peter Singer may indeed change the way you think about the world for the better. If not, at least get you asking questions about the world, which is really one of the points of the Origins podcast. So I really hope you enjoy our discussion together. And of course, you can watch it ad-free on our Substack site, Critical Mass, or you can wait and watch it on YouTube, or listen to it on any of the standard podcast listening sites. And I hope I'll be able to see some of you a few weeks from now, or maybe a week from now by the time this appears, in Los Angeles, in Orange County, for my lecture there at the Bowers Museum, and 2 days later in San Diego. That's October 15th and October 17th. Go to the originsproject.org website if you want to get tickets. And there's VIP tickets for a reception beforehand for both. I'll be signing some books. And in San Diego, I'll be having a discussion with Brian Keating for his podcast and my podcast. So if you live in the Southern California area, or you feel like visiting at that time, I hope you'll come out then for our Origins events, all of which go to support the programming that we can do in the Origins Project. Thanks again, and with no further ado, Peter Singer. Well, Peter, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a while since we've been together. I think I can't remember, the last time may have been in Mexico, I think, but that I saw you. But it's always a pleasure to spend time with you and to learn from you. So thanks for spending the time today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
It's it's a great chance to have the new version of the book, which I want to talk about in many ways, had an impact on my life. has come out, and it gave me a good chance to be able to read the new version. And that's the great thing about doing the podcast. I might have gotten it, but to read it in depth, it motivated me.
It's like a book club. You have to read it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, book clubs, you can sometimes finesse it, but I think if you're doing a podcast, at least in my opinion, I have to actually know what it says. But and I want to get to I want to focus for the most part on the new version, which is remarkable. But I want to. We spent time on stage together once, a very pleasant conversation we had in front of a few thousand people once in Phoenix. But I don't remember going into your origins as much as I do now. And since it's the Origins podcast, I really like to know what got people to where they are. And so I want to spend the first part of this conversation talking about that. I've looked at your bio and learned some things that I didn't know before, that your family come from Vienna. Is that right? We're sort of refugees from Hitler.
That's correct. Yes, my parents left as soon as they could after Hitler took over Austria. And so
they were very astute to leave when they did, but not all of your family left in time.
No, and it's a fairly common story that the younger generation left because they saw that they had no future. I don't think they were really contemplating that they would be murdered, but economically they had no future. Jews could not own businesses. My mother had just qualified at the University of Vienna as a doctor. Jewish doctors could only treat Jewish patients. But the problem was about a third of the population of Vienna was Jewish. About a third of the population of Vienna were doctors, and only about 10% of the population was Jewish. So we're not going to have that many patients.
Yeah.
So they decided to leave. But their parents, who were getting closer to the end of their careers, sort of procrastinated, I guess. They were eventually wanting to leave, but sadly they left it too late.
Yeah, I didn't realize I don't know when in your life you did a bio of your maternal grandfather who died in the concentration camps.
Yes, that's right. That was published, I think, 2003 or something like that. So about 20 years ago. I'd been working on it for a few years, actually. It was like a part-time project while I was doing my more academic work to read his books, because he wrote a couple of books and many articles. And read a lot of letters, all in German, so I read it quite slowly, and then to write it up.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm impressed and admire that. I thought my next book would be. I took a year off school 50 years ago to work on a history book, and I have all the material. And I told myself this next book is going to be taking. I took the box out. But it's intimidating after a while. But it's nice to just have a labor of love like that, and for you to learn. I mean, for like doing this podcast, if you're going to write a book, it forces you to read all the things you might not have read otherwise. And
that's right. And I got to know my grandfather, who of course I'd never known in flesh because he was murdered before I was born. But I did get to know him and his thought to the greatest possible extent.
Now you answered one question I was going to ask. When I read about your father, but I didn't read anything about your mother. I was going to ask what she did. So your mother was a doctor. Did she practice as a doctor in Australia when you moved there? When she moved there? Or?
She did, yes. She had to pass the Australian medical exams. It seems pretty incredible now, but the University of Melbourne or Australia generally did not recognize a medical degree from the University of Vienna. So she had to do all the exams again in English, of course, but she did manage to pass, and then she practiced for most of her life.
So your father had imported coffee or something, tea. So he had an education at the university education as well, or no?
He was educated at a school of commerce, business school in Vienna, rather than at the main campus of the university.
So that leads me to two questions, which I sometimes ask people. First of all, you're an academic, and I've always wondered what causes people to become academics. I know in my case what did, but did your mother or father have a bigger influence on you in that regard?
That's hard to say, really. I think it was kind of assumed that I would go to university. I had a sister 6 years older than me, and she had gone to university. And so I think that was assumed. But certainly it was my mother's side of the family that was more academic. My grandfather, the one who I wrote about, her father,
Oh, okay.
had actually had studied classics, Greek and Latin, and then taught them not at a university but at Vienna's most academic high school. And so, that was quite a high standard of teaching. And he also wrote articles, published articles related to his understanding of ancient Greek and
Really?
Latin.
So okay, so there was the academic aspect. It wasn't, as I've often said on this program, my mother wanted me to be a doctor. She was a Jewish mother and wanted me to be a doctor, but there wasn't any pressure on you to become a doctor or anything like that.
No. But there's one other thing that I should mention, actually, because I don't want to just have a male bias here, and that is that my grandmother, my mother's mother, also went to the University of Vienna. She was the 37th woman to graduate from the University of Vienna.
Wow.
And only the third woman to graduate in maths and physics.
She did math and physics.
Yeah, she did study that, and she actually had an invitation after she graduated to go to Berlin to work with Max Planck,
Wow.
but she turned it down because she wanted to marry my grandfather. So another case of a woman sacrificing her scientific career for a man. Not that she didn't have a career. She worked in as in an association of banks and bankers doing mathematical work for them, I think, but didn't have the scientific career she could have had.
You never know. She might have been happier. You never know.
Oh, quite possibly, yeah.
But that leads me naturally to the next question. I was going to say, with your mother's a doctor, and now with her mother as a math and physics, why didn't you become a scientist? I always wonder why people don't become scientists.
We had to make a choice at high school at that time. Made a choice at about in the third last year of high school. So you specialize for your last 2 years of high school.
Sure.
Either you're going to do maths and sciences, or you were going to do basically humanities subject. And I'd done fine at maths and the sciences, but I really enjoyed the others more, and I enjoyed writing. And maybe I got that a bit from my father, because though my father was not educated in that way, he was really interested in history. We had quite a library of history books. He was often talking about history. He also was quite gifted for languages, as well as, of course, German and English. He knew French quite well. So, maybe there was a bit of that in me in some way as well.
You preview the questions that I'm going to ask next. You naturally lead to them, because I was going to ask about reading. That's the other thing I'm always interested in. When you started reading, who influenced your reading? And I guess it was your father in that case more. And when you were younger, you read history, or did you read a lot of fiction, or did you read? What did you read? What got you interested in reading?
Well, I mean, depending how young I was, I read some bad boys fiction, I guess.
Good.
Which would now be considered horrendously racist.
Yeah.
Tales of brave white men exploring Australia, for example. But then I did read quite a bit of history. At some point, I actually read more or less from cover to cover Winston Churchill's 6-volume history of the Second World War.
Wow.
So I did get quite absorbed in that. Of course, the Second World War was fairly close at that stage, growing up in the 50s. And obviously it had been crucial to my family, and I felt that strongly. So I read that. But I also read, as a teenager, Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which was the first philosophy work that I read. And I enjoyed his clear style, and I enjoyed explanations of ideas that were quite new to me. So yeah, they were.
We're going to ask obviously how you ended up doing philosophy, but so Churchill, so he deserved the award he won for that book, you think?
Yeah, I thought he was an excellent writer.
He was an excellent speaker, and it's there aren't many Nobel Prizes or whatever that have gone for nonfiction books, so there's very few. And I admit I haven't read it. Now I think I maybe should turn to it, because I do love history. But you did study history. You studied law. You studied As an undergraduate. Well, so in high school, you had to specialize. You chose the humanities aspect for the last 2 years. When did you read Bertrand Russell? Was you still in high school?
Yes, I was still in high school. Yeah.
Okay. And I assume that piqued your interest in philosophy. That was the initial philosopher that you read, that sort of not Aristotle or any of the others. But
That's right. He was definitely the first philosopher I read. Yes, it did pique my interest, but so too did my older sister's boyfriend, who had studied a bit of philosophy and talked to me about it. And so I think he was a decisive factor in my deciding to not only study law, which was going to be my profession, and which in Australia, as in Britain, you started immediately as an undergraduate, but also doing history for interest, and then saying, okay, well, I can combine history and philosophy for the interest side of things.
Yeah, the new catch-all degree in the States that my stepdaughter did, and in England too, I think it's PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. I think.
Yeah,
sort of
yeah. I taught students in that in a couple of years when I taught at Oxford.
Yeah, well, there's that. So you added philosophy, but you planned to be a lawyer. Is that what you'd planned?
I did plan to be a lawyer. I never imagined that I could make a living as a philosopher, and I thought I do need to make a living. And it was only rather gradually that I let that slip. I mean, when I'd finished my BA and done well in that before I'd quite finished the law degree, and I was offered a graduate scholarship to go on and write a master's degree in philosophy. And so I went to the law faculty and said, can I postpone finishing my law degree? And they said, sure, yes, just come back when you've finished your MA. But then when I finished my MA, I got offered another scholarship to go to Oxford. So I postponed again.
There's still time. Okay, but it's interesting that you were going to be a lawyer, because again, my brother became a lawyer, and for my parents, it was important that we become professionals. They didn't go to university, but there was no pressure to you to be a professional in that sense. It was just your view that, well, it's pretty hard to earn a living hanging a shingle up saying philosopher, inquiry.
Yeah, I had no idea about that, and I hadn't really thought of being an academic at that point.
Now, this could be an error in one of your bios, and I think I forget which one. Did you do a second BA at Oxford?
No, I didn't. We call it Bachelor of Philosophy. It's strictly. I mean, it's weird, but Oxford is weird in many ways.
Yeah.
It's actually it is a postgraduate degree. You can't do it as an undergraduate, and yet it's called a Bachelor of Philosophy. It's a 2-year graduate degree, so it's a little shorter than doing a Doctor of Philosophy. It has some courses involved, which the Oxford doctorate had no courses. It was simply a thesis degree. And you did write a thesis, but the thesis was a shorter one than the Oxford DPhil. So when I asked people in my philosophy department in Melbourne what degree I should do, they recommended the BPhil because they said it's broader than doing the doctorate. And we'll still regard it as a qualification if you want to get a job and come back here. And they did, so I did come back with only a BPhil, and of course the master's and bachelor's degree. The fact that I didn't have a doctorate was not a barrier to getting an academic job at that time.
Interesting. So you never got the doctorate at Oxford. Okay, that's interesting.
That's right.
And but the thesis you wrote, the one that I think you published as a book, was the thesis you wrote while in Australia, right? Why should I be moral, or something like that? And
I wrote Why Should I Be Moral in Australia, but I didn't really publish that as a book, although it's figured in other books. I wrote a book called How Are We to Live, which is along that theme, but that came out more than 20 years later.
Much later. I know the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. You don't have a doctorate.
The Oxford philosophy thesis was published in a slightly expanded form. It's called Democracy and Disobedience.
Oh, that's right. Democracy.
It was about whether there's a right to civil disobedience in a democracy.
Oh, okay. Which becomes relevant in a way to animal liberation at some level, which we'll get to.
Well, that's true. But at the time, I was thinking more of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, sure. Which is I was. How could one? I was going to say, how could one not protest against the Vietnam War? I guess a lot of people didn't, My friend Noam Chomsky tells me most academics didn't, but were you active in the UK or in Australia? I guess it would have
I
been.
was more active in Australia as an undergraduate. When doing my master's, I actually was the leader of a group called Melbourne University Students Against Conscription, or Campaign Against Conscription, I think it was. So that was after the draft was introduced in Australia. It was specifically campaigning against that, and that was introduced in order to provide troops to serve alongside our American allies in Vietnam.
I didn't realize there was conscription in Australia too. Huh. Okay, in Vietnam. So
yeah, and that obviously was a good political rallying point. I mean, I was against the war even without that, of course, but in terms of rallying people who didn't want to serve and whose parents didn't want their children to serve, that was a strong point.
Okay, well, so civil disobedience, and then a very important meeting, which I've heard you talk about. Actually, you mentioned it briefly in Animal Liberation, and I read more about it with a fellow student. I was very pleased to see that student is now, I don't know if he still is, but became a professor at Cape Breton University, which is not too far away from where I live. And another reason for you to come visit.
Well, that was actually the reason I visited Prince Edward Island the first time, as I mentioned, when we were talking before we started recording. I went to visit him and his wife, Mary, in Sydney, Cape Breton, with my wife and our very small child, to see them again, because we'd been really close at Oxford. And they were living there. And then we decided we would see a bit more of Canada. So we hired a car and drove from Cape Breton to Montreal, stopping at a few places on the way. And Prince Edward Island was one of them.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad you've been there. I hope you'll, as I said before we began recording, I hope you'll come back. But he had a profound effect on you. So why don't you review that briefly for the listeners?
He had an extremely profound effect on me, and it was just an accidental meeting. He was a fellow graduate student at Oxford, and there was a class that we attended together, but the class had nothing to do with animals. But after the class, I'd asked a question at one particular session, and after the class, he asked me whether I'd been satisfied with the answer that had been given. And we talked about that a little, and the conversation started to get into deeper issues. And he said, "Why don't we have lunch?" Because the class finished just before lunch. You can come back to my college and we can continue the conversation. So he invited me to Balliol College for lunch, and we were offered a choice of two dishes. There was a hot dish, which was spaghetti, and there was a salad plate. And the spaghetti had a kind of nondescript red-brown sauce on top of it. And Richard said, "Can you tell me if there's meat in the sauce?" And when he was told there was, he took the salad plate. So I took the spaghetti, and we sat down, we ate our lunches, and we finished the conversation that we'd been having about the class. And then I asked him, because it was really unusual in, this is 1970, to meet somebody who had a problem with eating meat, and he didn't seem to be a Hindu or anything like that. So I said, basically, why did you ask that question about the meat? Do you have a problem with eating meat? And I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought maybe he would think it was bad for his health. There were some people around like that then, though not many. I thought maybe he's going to be a complete pacifist, who says just killing is wrong, full stop. But instead he said something much simpler. He said, "I don't think it's right to treat animals in the way that animals are treated, to be made into our food." And that surprised me, because I thought that animals have good lives on farms. I thought they were all outside in the fields, grazing away happily. Of course, then they get rounded up and trucked off to slaughter. They have one terrible day in their life. But, is that so bad? But he said, no, that's not true anymore. Many animals are indoors now. They're very crowded, or perhaps they're in feedlots. Whatever can be done to make it cheaper to produce their meat is done. So really, we're doing all sorts of bad things to give them pretty horrible lives. And And I was surprised by that. I wanted to learn more. He recommended the one book that I think existed then on that subject, a book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines. And I read that and I found that very convincing too. And so I joined Richard and a couple of other friends that he knew in Oxford who were vegetarians.
Oh, wow. And right then, and right then you became vegetarian and you remained that. You never had withdrawal symptoms or anything like that.
No, I never had withdrawal symptoms. Yeah. I would say it was not instant. I should mention I was already married by then. So I obviously went home and told my wife about this conversation that I'd had. And she looked at the book by Ruth Harrison as well. So it was a joint decision.
It has to be. It's
Yeah,
got
it
to be
has to
hard.
be.
I do know some families where one spouse is a vegetarian and the other isn't, but it's got to be hard.
I honestly think I probably could not have done it at that stage because, you were going to make yourself into a kind of crank in many people's eyes.
Yeah,
and if my wife had thought that too and not
Yeah.
supported me, it would have been too hard for
I
me.
can understand that. Yeah, no, that's great that you both, well, a joint decision, and we'll talk similar here. So, and we'll get to but your development of philosophy and your own philosophy, I want to talk about the context of animal liberation, comes from the idea, and I don't know if this verbiage is yours or the equal consideration of interests, which is a central sort of term and a central idea that really forms the basis of animal liberation and your views about that and many other things.
Yeah.
You want to explain that a little bit?
Yes. And that is not, I didn't put those words together, the equal consideration of interests. I took them from an article written by the philosopher Stanley Benn, but he was not writing about animals. He was writing about what is the basis for equality among humans. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he was the only one to use that phrase either. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but he wrote quite a prominent article. And this was a puzzle that philosophers were talking about at that time. So we say that all humans are equal, but what exactly do we mean by that? Because it's obvious that humans differ in, how tall they are, how strong they are. They differ in regard to sex. They differ in regard to abilities, whatever it might be, academic abilities, musical abilities, sporting abilities. So what does it mean to say they're equal? And one of the answers that seemed to me to be a reasonably plausible answer to that was to say, well, they're all entitled to have their interests equally considered. So, we have interests in living our lives well and having a good life and not suffering pain and misery. And there's no reason why those who are of our race or of our sex or any other of those groups that you might think, why their interests should count more than those of other races, sexes, and different groups, nationalities. So fundamentally, humans are all entitled to have their interests given equal consideration. And I agree with that. And I think I still agree with that. But why does this stop at the boundary of our species? That was the question that Ben didn't ask. And when I looked at other philosophers who talked about equality and come up with other answers, similar ones, generally, they didn't ask that question either.
Which is the basis of what you would call, central to the book, again, the idea of speciesism. The fact that people don't even ask that question is speciesist, I guess is the way to say it, is the assumption that one doesn't even have to ask the question.
That's right. That's right. There is just that completely unspoken assumption. And whereas if somebody made it on the basis of race or sex, we would think that's outrageous. Mm-hmm. But why don't we think that about species? Well, maybe because we are in the same situation as the most blatant racists in a racist society would have been when they didn't even question the idea that you don't have to give equality to blacks.
Exactly. And your point, and we'll get to it probably later, is that if one of the purposes of philosophy is to cause us to question things that we wouldn't normally question, that are accepted assumptions without thinking, that if that's the purpose of philosophy, it's kind of disappointing that philosophers on the whole had fallen into the trap of of not even asking that question.
Yes, it is disappointing, and of course, it does make us wonder about what is it that we're blind about today that we're not seeing.
Yeah. Well, now we're almost this is natural segue to getting to the details of the book, but I do want to. I mean, the context of the book too, and what you talk about. The other thing that at least I know you for, and I'm not a philosopher, although I read a bunch of your books. Well, is the basis of your philosophy, one would say, is utilitarianism. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
You want to describe that again for people, sort of?
Sure. So utilitarianism is an ethical view which firstly says that actions are right or wrong in accordance with their consequences. So if their consequences on the whole are good, all things considered, then the actions are right. And if the consequences are bad, all things considered, the actions are wrong. And means that's a description of a general family of theories that we now call consequentialism for obvious reasons. And it's different from those theories that say, no, here's an absolute rule. You must never tell a lie, no matter what the consequences of telling a lie, let's say. But utilitarianism is one form of consequentialism. It's the form that says the consequences that matter are consequences for well-being, essentially for happiness and avoidance of its opposite, pain or suffering. So the consequences we want to judge actions as right or wrong by are, have they maximized the surplus of happiness over misery, or if there is no such surplus, minimized the surplus of misery over happiness.
Now, is that, well, I want to get to it, but that when one starts talking about maximizing and minimizing, it does bring up the idea of effective altruism. So maybe we'll get there in a second, I guess. But that does mean, and you already alluded to this, that is something which, of course, I happen to agree with, that this idea of absolute moral or absolute ethics doesn't make sense, because in some cases, at some times, and some places, the consequences of a behavior can be good, and at other times, the consequences of the same behavior can be bad, which means that there's that behavior or that attitude or whatever you want to call it is not absolutely morally or ethically reprehensible, but it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, well, that's certainly my view and the utilitarian view, but there are some ethicists who've denied that, who've said, no, even, there's this Latin saying, do justice though the heavens fall, right? Or the world perishes. Now, to me, that's crazy. I mean, it's like saying, well, it would be worth waging a nuclear war if otherwise somebody would unjustly benefit. That's crazy.
I'm obviously, I'm not sympathetic to, and as a scientist, I'm not sympathetic to, which surprises some people because, physics, some people think of as absolute laws, and it's absolutely not the case. One of the greatest, most important development in physics in the last 50 or 60 years is the realization that there's no absolute truths in science. There's science can prove what's absolutely false, but not what absolutely true. And even the laws of physics evolve. And there's no theory, even our best theories, that applies in every case in the universe. That's a surprise, I think, to a lot of people. But it meshes with certainly my personal view of, looking at history and anthropology and other things. I remember when I was younger, it really hit me that some things I had just naturally taken for granted as being good, I could see I learned in certain times in history and in certain societies were not viewed that way at all. And it opened up my eyes to the notion that maybe, I think I'm not sophisticated enough to call myself a consequentialist, perhaps utilitarian, but it's, I think, the basis of my own view of the world. But I did read somewhere that the version of utilitarianism that you're associated with is called hedonistic, which really broke. I never thought of you as a hedonist, but
that's
want to explain that?
The popular sense of hedonist means that I'm, enjoying. I'm lying out in the sun with a glass of wine and whatever, and so that's an egoistic hedonist, I suppose. Somebody who's only thinking about their own pleasure. But utilitarians are universal hedonists. That is, they're thinking about the pleasure of everyone. And in fact, and this is an interesting point, that utilitarians actually have consistently talked about the pleasure and pain of non-human animals matters too. You have to look for it, especially in Bentham, the founder of the English School of Utilitarians. There's only a few brief notes, but there is a very important footnote in one of his works that shows that he was very clearly aware of this, but didn't push it. He was too far ahead of his time. There were no laws in England in his at that stage to actually prevent people being cruel to animals at all.
Huh. Okay. Well, then one moved. Okay, and when one talks about utilitarianism, I'd never heard of the term effective altruism until I learned it from you. I think if I'm right in reading, I think in this book or some other book that you got it from some students from.
It was actually, yes. There was a group of students in Oxford about 2008 or 2009, somewhere in that, who had formed this group. They had to some extent been inspired by one of my writings, and they thought that they should do more good, and they were particularly at that stage focused on helping people in extreme poverty, which is an issue I'd written about as well. And they wanted a name for their group, and they tossed around a dozen or so names, and eventually they decided to vote on them. And the name that came out on top was Effective Altruism. So, that was a collective decision. I don't know whether one of them particularly proposed that or argued for it, but it was a collective decision.
Well, it's caught on. But you want to describe that sort of the another difference, but it obviously stems from consequentialism, but you want to explain what one means by effective altruism.
Yeah, sure. So altruism is, most people understand, it's like doing good for others. Mm-hmm. And most people think that that's a nice idea, but not very many people think about the importance of making your doing good for others as effective as you can. When people give to charity, for example, they often give very impulsively. They see a picture of a smiling child and they think, oh, that's a good charity, I'll donate to them, or some friend is giving to them. But it makes a huge difference which charity you donate to. Let's just stay with the example of being altruistic by donating to a charity. It makes a huge difference, and I'm not talking about charities that are frauds. There's a very small number of them that, of course, are a complete waste of money. But even among charities that you think of as good, that are doing quite a good purpose, there can be other charities that might do hundreds of times as much good with your donation. And people find that hard to believe. But so let me give you an example. A good charity that most people would accept as a good charity is one that trains guide dogs to help people who are blind, right? Mm-hmm. It's somebody who's blind can get around better with a guide dog. Doesn't seem to, the guide dog seems to enjoy the work in a sense. So it's a nice thing to do. But it's pretty expensive because it takes a lot of skilled training to train the guide dog, and you have to then train the blind person to be with the dog. So roughly it costs you $40,000 US to train a guide dog. Now, what else could you do with that? Well, this is something I owe to Toby Ord, who's one of the pioneers of one of these students I was mentioning at Oxford in the early 2000s. He looked around for other things he could do, and he found that at that time anyway, there was an article that said that for $25, you could prevent someone becoming blind by treating trachoma, which is the major cause of preventable blindness. It's a main cause of blindness in hot, dusty countries without a lot of hygiene. So think North Africa, for example. And yet it's very easy to prevent. So, think of the difference between, helping one blind person and preventing someone becoming blind. It's obviously better to prevent someone becoming blind at all. And then think of the cost difference, right? $25 versus $40,000. Now it's pretty easy to see that there's actually more than 1,000-fold good done in donating to the nonprofit that treats trachoma than in the nonprofit that trains guide dogs. perhaps the cost of that treating trachoma has gone up now. Maybe the low-hanging fruit has been picked. Maybe it's $100, but it's still $100 compared to 40,000. It's still 400 times as much. So this group really went through that, worked that out, and decided they needed to publicize it. Toby Ord set up a group called Giving What We Can to publicize that, and emphasize the importance of actually doing some research into what are the best ways to do good. And I think that's the biggest contribution that the effective altruism movement has made. It does popularize the idea of living to some extent altruistically. It doesn't say you have to be a saint, but yes, having altruism as part of part of your goals of life. But then it emphasized the importance of doing the research, or now you can look up the research online, and finding the most effective ways to be an altruist.
Well, yeah, and you promoted too in your books. You wrote at least one or two books about.
Yeah, I have a book called "The Most Good You Can Do."
Good You Can Do. I remember that. And well, first, before we get there, I mean, that research is useful to the extent people learn about it. So, is there a place people can go? There must be a website you could give.
There are a couple, and there's actually another book that I wrote called "The Life You Can Save," which is specifically about global poverty.
Yeah.
And that led to an organization being founded. A guy approached me and said, this book ought to be turned into an organization. And I'd put up a website about it, but that's about all I got to do. And he said, I volunteered to do it. He was somebody who'd had a guy called Charlie Bresley, who'd had a career in men's retailing, been quite successful in a national men's clothing chain. But decided that really didn't satisfy him. That wasn't really what he wanted to do with his life. So he took early retirement from that and volunteered to set up this organization, The Life You Can Save, which does some research of its own and aggregates other research. And you can go to thelifeyoucansave.org and you can find a curated list of 20 plus organizations helping people in extreme poverty that have been assessed for being highly effective in what they do.
Well, that's great. I wanted to get that information out, and that's great. But you've done. So it sounds like it's something everyone could agree with and want to do. But you've gone further, and I do want to mention you're suggesting something, and I think most people find a lot harder to do. Although I understand that you do it, which is not just maximum good you can do, but the fact that the maximum good you can do involves a significant fraction of your own income. If you're living in relatively materially successful, it's not just doing the 1% or the 10%, but 40 or 50 or 60%. And you, to motivate that, it's again, as far as I know, you introduced this analogy of a drowning child. But maybe why don't you give it here? I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, right. Yes, this was the article that influenced people, the students I mentioned in forming the effective altruism movement. So I was trying to argue that people who are comfortably off ought to be doing something to help people in extreme poverty, particularly emphasizing that when people are in extreme poverty, they die, or their children particularly die disproportionately. And so to meet the sort of objection where people would say, well, I'm not responsible for the fact that these children in wherever they are in low-income countries are dying. That's nothing to do with me. So why do I have to help them? I ask people to imagine that they're walking across a park that has a shallow pond in it, and they see, to their surprise, that a small child seems to have fallen into the pond and is floundering around, looks like it's about to drown, and there's nobody there looking after the child. No parents, no babysitter, no lifeguard. So what do, right? Well, the first thing you think is, I'd better run and jump into the pond and pull the child out. No danger to me, because I know that this pond is quite shallow. But your second not so nice thought is, but I've put on my best clothes today because I'm going somewhere I need to impress people, and I don't have time to get them off, and they're going to get ruined. And then you stop and think at that point. Now, suppose that you decided you weren't going to ruin your clothes and you walked on. What would you think of that person? and most people would, I hope, will say, and I'm sure you would, that would be a horrible thing to do, right? So once I've got you saying that would be a horrible thing to do, then you're accepting that to save a child's life, you ought to give up something. At least you ought to, be prepared to ruin those expensive shoes and save the child. And so then the question is, well, where does this stop, right? And now the drowning child example gets a little crazy, but you imagine that there's more children. You have to keep saving them each time you walk past the pond or whatever. So it is hard to say where the limit is. And I don't really claim now to say that I know where the limit is or that I live up to an ideal limit. I think I would probably have to do a lot more sacrificing, a lot more giving than I do to really be at a limit where I could say, there's nowhere further that I ought to go. But I think if you're comfortably off, as I am, then you do need to give something quite substantial. I don't think it's enough to just give small token donations because it's not really going to make your life into something just terrible. It's not going to make nearly as big a difference to your life as what you can donate is going to make to the lives of the people who will benefit from it, assuming, of course, as we've been saying, that you do give to an organization that will use your donation effectively.
Yeah, no, I know personally, I do know you do a lot, and that leads me to the last question before we specifically get to animal liberation, because this is relevant. The last question I'll talk about later on about what we can do, but one of the things when you think about, the drowning child analogy is one way of thinking about it, but you have talked or written about something very important, which is the evolutionary basis of altruism. And that understanding the evolutionary base of altruism, if you're trying to think how to get people to lead good lives or act altruistically or do more than they do, and it's always a challenge to try and figure out how to do it. And one way is to think about what's led to altruism in the first place and how you can utilize the evolutionary basis of altruism as a way to help convince people to act. I wonder if you want to talk about that. Is it basically a guide for understanding the evolutionary basis of altruism as a guide for influencing public policy, for example? Something it makes, so anyway, I think I've explained enough.
So, there's a lot to be said about evolution, altruism, and ethics. And first, maybe let me say something about what I think is the wrong way to use evolution. And that's the way that was used by social Darwinists in the 20th century, I guess, particularly when they read Darwin, they accepted, and they said, okay, so therefore, life is simply a struggle for survival, and we must let the weak fall by the wayside, and we must champion the strong so that they survive. But there's that kind of moral lesson. The evolutionary theory is not teaching you a moral lesson; it's telling you how it is that we got here, and now we are here. And the question is, what ought we to do? Now, it's true that if you understand evolution, you might question whether altruism is possible at all, because you might say, well, didn't evolution make us selfish in terms of firstly ensuring our own survival? And secondly, as say Richard Dawkins and others would teach us, extending that to our kin and those who carry the same genes as we do, so that that favors the survival of those genes. And that may be true, and that may be consistent with the forms of altruism that are widely shared. So altruism for your kin, particularly the closer children, altruism also for those you're in a close and reciprocal relationship with, because that can benefit you, so your friends basically, as well as them. And what we might call universal altruism is rarer. But it does exist, and it's interesting that it exists because, for example, people do help strangers. People give donate blood, which is going to go to strangers, not really going to benefit them. And the effective altruism movement basically shows a lot of people act altruistically to strangers in a variety of ways. So a further question then was, how does that happen? And there are different answers that could be given. I've talked to Richard Dawkins about it. He says it's a kind of spandrel, it's sort of like the peacock's tail in some way. It's something that just happens and gets selected for in a strange way. And I don't find that entirely convincing. My view is that it has to do with the fact that we also evolved to be able to reason. Again, clearly it benefited us to be able to reason and helped us to survive. But I see reason, I use the metaphor of reason being like an escalator. So once you start reasoning, you can't necessarily just jump off at any point, or you can try, but it's sort of, there's this cognitive dissonance. So once we reason, we understand that strangers are very like us, that they suffer like we do. And then we understand just what I was saying before, that, well, here am I spending a lot of money on something that I don't really need and that isn't going to make me, transform my life in a wonderful way permanently. And with that amount of money, I could make a much bigger difference to the lives of other people. And so that starts to say, well, they do matter just as I matter. So why not do that? So, my explanation, or I should say partial explanation, because I'm sure it's not the only factor, is that our ability to reason helps us to reach the ethical judgment that this is a good thing to do, that helping others, even if they're strangers, even if they're not our kin or our friends, is an ethical thing to do.
Excellent. Okay. Well, now and then. I was going to get to preference voting, but I think we've waited long enough to get to the heart of the matter, which is not just how to help your friends and neighbors and other people, but how to help animals and to treat animals' interests and as equal to our own, in the sense that they have equal. We have to consider their interests equally. So Animal Liberation was written in 1975. And I have to say, I'm going to try and be a devil's advocate in some of this, because I want to try and provoke, so to give you the opportunity to answer questions. Some things I'm intrigued by and may not agree with, but anyway, but on the whole I do. And therefore it's hard to become a devil's advocate. It has a profound effect in my own life, I have to say, because I will say this, and people always say I make it about me, but anyway, I remember when my daughter was about 7, we were in Aspen. I was doing a book signing at a bookstore called the Explore Bookstore there, which was one of my favorite bookstores. Katharine Thalberg, you probably know them, maybe. Katharine Thalberg. I
was there actually, but wasn't there a bookstore? Wasn't there a bookstore called the Tattered Page or something like that?
No, that's in Denver. Tattered Cover, not in Aspen. There's a famous Tattered Cover. Maybe now they've changed it, but the original, it used to be called the Explore Bookstore, and it was run by Katharine Thalberg.
I was there once, but it was quite a long time ago too.
And her husband Bill Stirling.
Yeah, I met him.
Mayor of Aspen, and they were famous because they had a big controversy. They tried to ban furs in Aspen.
Yeah, I was that's why I was there. That's where I met them. Yeah, they brought me in to talk against furs.
Good, excellent. And well, around that time, or a little bit after, we were there, and my daughter was 6 or 7 and loved Catherine's dogs. There are always dogs in the store. And so Catherine gave my 7-year-old daughter, she said, here's a book you have to read. It was Animal Liberation. And my daughter's a vegetarian now, and I don't know if there was a causal relationship there, but it had an impact. And it's nice to see, so it's an important book, but it's really nice to see that it's been up. I'm not sure updated is the right way to say, but it has. It's been brought to a lot of things have changed, and a lot of things haven't changed. And I think that's the key point. It's sort of, one reads this as saying, yes, there's progress, but on the other hand, not only is there not enough progress, in some sense, we've taken steps backwards in certain ways. And it's frustrating that your own frustration comes out. We'll come there. And I'm now, by the way, don't eat meat. Although I still haven't yet removed fish from my diet completely, being surrounded by the water here. And
right, so you waved a hand at the water. Does that mean you haul the fish out of the water yourself, or
well, that's it. We'll get there. We'll get there, because I've actually, We'll get there because I did fly fish, and I fly fish here. And now when I fly fish here, I hope I don't catch fish because it's so much more relaxing. I do it for my kayak.
All
But
right.
actually, I don't think I would catch fish anymore. I don't think I used to catch fish, and I used to do the worst thing, which was catch them and leave them in my bag and drive them back. This was in Colorado. And then I finally realized, no, I should kill them right away. And
Right.
instead, and at least that's better.
So many people who fish don't realize that. It's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, well, it's not easy. I mean, it's, and it for some reason, and maybe it's this, you talked about this in terms of how we can convince ourselves. I forget there's a term I'm going to use later. Convince ourselves we're doing the right thing when it's what we want to do. But it seems neglecting the fish is a lot easier than taking a rock and hitting them on the head with it. That's an overt act of killing. And in fact, it's the kindest thing you can do, but it's a lot. It seems more violent than just letting them die, and it's really weird. It's really a weird thing. Anyway, we'll get there because I do want to talk about fish, or at least, and the mussels and oysters, which is something I understand you have your own issues about. I do. This is a big lobster place, and I've stopped eating lobster for the moment after reading your book because I really have to. I've always thought that this illusion that lobsters felt pain when they were being boiled was an illusion, but I understand there's new research in that regard. But we'll get there. It's based on the bottom line is that your book is based on the fact that the equal consideration of interests it's speciesist to assume that stops at humans. So why don't you just take it from there?
Yes, well, there's a lot to take.
Yeah, I know, and I'll try and lead you through it, but
yes.
Give you
right. So if you have that principle of equal consideration of interests, then you have to ask yourself, how serious are the interests of the animals that are violated here, and how important are these interests to us humans? So the first point is, of course, we don't need to eat animals to survive. That's well known nowadays. Everybody knows people who are vegetarian or vegan. If you're vegan, it's advisable to take some B12, but otherwise you don't need to eat them. So it's a matter of choice about your diet. You think that you enjoy these things more, maybe, but once you learn some non-animal based cooking, plant-based cooking, I think there's lots of great dishes out there. There's a wide variety of cuisines. I would really challenge somebody to show that they get more enjoyment from their food than I do.
By the way, the new book reintroduces the recipes. I was very happy.
That's right. It reintroduces in a more personalized way some of my favorite recipes from the first edition. That's right. So that's the first thing. And then what happens to the animals? And this goes back to what we were talking about before, what Richard Keshen alerted me to, and Ruth Harrison documented in her book, and which unfortunately is still going on with the great majority of the meat produced. And that is the animals are confined indoors. They're very crowded. This is particularly with chickens and turkeys and also with pigs. But cattle are also spend a good part of their lives on feedlots. And these are really very bad lives for animals, and for a whole variety of reasons. By
the way, we will go through each of them. I want to spend a little time with each of them, so we'll have more time.
Okay, so yes, you were starting out with the kind of basis of it. So if that's the case, then I don't think we're justified in supporting those industries for needs that are not vital to ourselves. And I should add, of course, that in terms of net food production, feeding grains and soybeans to animals is just wasteful. It doesn't produce more food for
climate. I want to get to those factors, but I wanted to start with just the basic, if you wish, philosophical notion.
So it is that idea which we've talked about before, that that pain is bad, pleasure, happiness is good, and that to say that they're only good when they apply to humans is in some ways analogous. I'm not saying it's a parallel in every respect, of course, but in some ways it's analogous to what racists and sexists have said about blacks and women. So I think we need to get past that prejudice. We need to recognize that non-human animals can feel pain. Again, maybe not all of them. You mentioned oysters before. I'm not going to say that oysters can feel pain, but certainly all the vertebrates and some of the invertebrates. You mentioned the lobsters, octopus also is another one, invertebrate you could think about, are capable of feeling pain, and so we shouldn't sacrifice their interest in avoiding pain for relatively minor interests of ours.
Okay, and that's that notion that consideration should not extend to animals other than humans is you've called speciesism, in analogy to racism. I actually, I know it's near the end of your book, but I was still I was looking again at the bio. I think it's the Wikipedia bio of you, and I was kind of amazed how people take for granted this notion that that's not a good thing to do, and especially philosophers who you think. This quote, which I hadn't seen before in your book, but I did see in this, I think it was in the Wikipedia bio of you, Roger Scruton, who criticized your book, Animal Liberation. I was shocked at this quote, that book contains little or no philosophical arguments. They derive their radical moral conclusions from the vacuous utilitarianism that counts the pain and pleasure of all living things as equally significant, and ignores just about everything that's been said in our philosophical tradition about the real distinction between persons and animals. What has been said in our philosophical tradition about that real distinction? I mean, I was amazed that it ignores everything we said about the distinction between the real philosophical distinctions between humans and animals, of which he didn't elaborate. I kind of was shocked.
Yes, right. Well, I'm not sure who he was thinking of. Aristotle famously thought that everything exists for us, basically, a pre-Darwinian view of our role. He may have been thinking of Kant, who regarded the fact that we are self-aware, autonomous beings as entitling us to use and not having obligations towards those beings who are not. But to me, the definitive answer to that was given by Bentham in that footnote that I mentioned earlier, where he says the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer?
Can they suffer? And we're going to get to. I love how you're leading me along to just where I want to go, but I must say what upset me most. It pushed my buttons. Not if I have problems with philosophy, and I do every now and then, and people seem to think I have a case against philosophy. I don't. But the one kind of argument that I hate is the appeal to authority. When I've been in debates or discussions and I see people quote Kant or Aristotle, who cares? I mean, it's fine. These are good thinkers, but that's not an argument. That's saying these great thinkers have said this. It's the quality of their argument, not the who said it, that matters. It seems to me. And so, saying that this philosophical tradition, who cares about traditions? The question is what is the distinction between human and animals, and does it validate treating them significantly differently? In certain ways, yes. I mean, I don't have a conversation I do converse with my dog, actually, but I don't expect my dog to respond in that regard. Right. But anyway, so it pushed my own buttons. But you hit. I don't know if you want. Now we won't go there. But the key thing is the capacity to suffer. That's often the argument that's made. If someone has something or some entity has a capacity to suffer, we should not cause them to suffer unduly if we can avoid it.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, Bentham also, went on to say, well, if we're talking about being able to reason or talk, then a horse or a dog is better at it than an infant of a day or a week or a month old.
Yeah, we'll get to the distinction between dogs or monkeys or great apes and young children, which is something you've brought up, which upsets some people, but it's true. Well, at least the fact that they can reason better is certainly true. But let me now try and at least push on this a little bit. It's a question of degree, and it's a question of where you draw the line, of course. And you point out, well, maybe the line is between shrimps and oysters or mussels, and then you go past that later on and talk about insects being sentient. But this really hit me because in my new book, the last, which is about things we don't know, My last chapter is about consciousness, which is something I thought in advance we knew the least about, and after spending a lot of time reading about it, I'm convinced I was right. Consciousness is something that it's hard to even define, much less know where it is. And a discussion with Chomsky, he said he thought maybe the notion of focusing on consciousness and the mechanisms of consciousness may be itself ill-advised. But one thing that was clear is that we tend to equate behavior with awareness or behavior with consciousness, and that's clearly inappropriate. So, amoeba and other, in single-celled animals, single-celled living entities will have behavior that makes it appear as if they're conscious. They can even almost appear to have learned where not to travel, or how to be away from a hot or an acid solution or something like that. And so we have to be particularly careful. And I think Joseph Ledoux and others of the people that I've read have said that to distinguish between behavior and awareness or consciousness. And so, and then to take that a little bit further, Damasio was another guy who said basically the key thing that he thinks that leads to conscious awareness, self-awareness, is feelings. Is the fact that we have feelings that first started just as homeostasis, being aware of being able to manipulate what's happening in our body by nervous system helps a complicated organism maintain its homeostatic condition, whereas a simple organism doesn't need a central nervous system necessarily to do that. But that leads to feelings. But then we have to be careful to, again, not attribute the causal relationships between behavior, between stimulus and behavior and feelings could be different than what you think it might be. Again, to take the example of anxiety, as Ledoux talked about, we tend to think that that these anti-anxiety drugs will stop anxiety. What they tend to do is stop the physiological response. But it's quite likely that the physiological response is what ultimately produces the sense of anxiety sometimes later on, rather than the other way around. And so if we assume that people are in pain or suffering, we may be just anthropomorphizing. So in an extreme way. And to assume that is it may be inappropriate. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think you're right that we can't identify behavior with mental states like suffering or pain, but they can be a reasonable indication of it. And I think, they're one of the important indications. Another indication might be trying to directly observe a nervous system and see to what extent it parallels ours. And I think that works for vertebrates to some extent, but it isn't always enough, because even with vertebrates, there might be different parts of the brain involved. And so, you were talking about fish before. That's why there were some challenges to the idea that fish can feel pain. But, then how do you show that it seems like some other parts of the brain are actually performing this function of consciousness in fish from the do in us? Well, one way would be to try and look at the behavior and look at it in a somewhat more sophisticated way. So I think you're right that just, there's no reason to believe that an amoeba can feel pain just because it moves away from something that could damage or threaten it. But when you look at fish, there's research that shows that they actually will make trade-offs between things that normally they seem to want to do, preferred states, and those that they want to avoid. So, yes, if you put a barrier in a tank that will give a fish an electric shock if it passes through it, it won't pass through it. But suppose that this is a fish that has a companion, the kind of fish that it pairs up with another member of its species, and the mate is on the other side of this barrier. Will the fish go through it? Well, that will depend on how strong the shock is. So if the shock is not extremely severe, yes, the fish will cross the barrier. if the shock is really severe, the fish may not cross the barrier. And the same will be if you vary the incentive to being food, for instance, and how hungry the fish might be. So it looks like they're trading off in a somewhat similar way to what we might do. And then another factor is if you give them analgesics, it seems to have a similar kind of effect that it would on us. That is, they are readier to do things that would otherwise previously have caused them some pain. So it's, when you get these kinds of parallels, I think it's reasonable to say the balance of probability is that they're conscious and can feel pain. It's not certainty, I agree with that, but I certainly think it's a balance that we ought to give them, to give them the benefit of the doubt, in other words.
The benefit of the doubt. I was going to get there. I think your argument, the strongest argument we make is that we don't know, and we might as well give them the benefit of the doubt on the whole. But I guess I constantly want to ask that skeptical question. The behavior of the fish. Well, the fish it has by evolution some behavior, which is reproductive behavior, wanting to be with a mate, need to eat, et cetera, which may have nothing to do with intent, clearly. And if the thing that's produced, like the shock, causes humans pain, it may cause. We don't know that it's pain in a fish. It's just maybe something that their internal homeostatic system says it's best to avoid. But the argument, I want to use your own words against you in some sense here. Well, I was taken by this because you talk about plants,
yeah,
and whether plants are intelligent. It's an interesting, a question. But you said this advance in our understanding of plants shows that they're not the passive objects that we may imagine they are. Quite interestingly, I thought the discussion was interesting. But this does not show that they are conscious or capable of feeling pleasure or pain. Self-driving cars can communicate by sending electrical signals, are intelligent and can learn from their mistakes, but they're not conscious. It's true that plants are natural, evolved living beings, whereas self-driving cars are inanimate objects made by humans. That is not, however, sufficient reason for concluding that plants are conscious. If we can design objects that respond intelligently to their circumstances, but without being conscious, then hundreds of millions of years of evolution could produce a similar outcome. And so I would, in some sense, would say, couldn't you use that argument for most animals? 100 million years have caused the animals to appear to be intelligent without being conscious or self-aware or even feeling the kind of feelings that we do.
And obviously you're right. I'm using it to suggest that plants are complex but are not conscious. I think in the case of vertebrates, the evidence is much more plausible that something similar has evolved in them than in us, because we have a common origin, and the behavior is similar in the ways that I suggest, and the anatomy and physiology are similar to some respects and differ, depending on what species we're talking about. So I think it's much more reasonable to say it probably works in the same way, and there is some kind of awareness as there is with us. The more difficult cases are the ones where there isn't a common origin. And I have to acknowledge that isn't only plants, it's also invertebrates. So I assume, this can't be certain, but looking at what others have written about it, I assume that the common ancestor of us and an octopus was not a conscious being. It seems like, we're talking maybe as much as 500 million years ago, and seems likely to have been a simple organism that wasn't conscious. And yet, when we look at the behavior of the octopus, and of course, millions of people have now seen that Octopus, My Teacher film. Yeah. But even without that, there's a lot of research about what octopus can do and how clever they are and so on. So it's, yes, I think your objection might apply to an octopus. Give me some doubt, but I can't really say that
I'll give it. I've already octopi are intelligent. I stopped eating them around before that film, but other thing. Just amazing how intelligent they are. But but nevertheless, people, again, when I tried to understand consciousness, people would say, yeah, we have a common origin. But if you look at the prefrontal cortex, if you look at the way the neurons are developed in that part of the human brain, we share that at most with some of the great apes and maybe some birds. And so there are differences. So I guess the question is, and this is the question I think you face yourself, where does this stop? Does it ever stop? Does it go all the way down to plants? Or there is some line? And I think, of course, it's hard to know. And I guess the only answer one can give is, unless there's a good reason, give them the benefit of the doubt. Unless you need to, give them the benefit of the doubt. But again, you drew the line, I think, somewhere originally between shrimps and oysters, and I think you still do. But
yeah, I still do. And though in general I accept your view, and we do have to eat something, so that would be a reason for eating plants, if anyway. But I think also in evolutionary terms, it's reasonable to think that consciousness is more likely to have evolved in beings who can move away from danger that they sense. And that would be a reason for thinking that there are a lot of animals, possibly even insects, who can be conscious, but not plants, and not an oyster, because an oyster...
But again, single bacteria and amoeba can certainly move away from danger.
That's right. But then it's just so hard to imagine that the capacity for consciousness can reside in, a single cell.
Well, maybe that's speciesist. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to imagine.
It's what is it? Multicellularist.
Yeah. It's multicellularism. But maybe next century that'll become
multicellularism is more reasonable than speciesism.
I think the key question is the difficult question. It's a difficult question none of us can answer. Is who can suffer, and I think. And that's a problem. That's a deep problem that I don't know. Each of us may decide on our own level, because I don't, if we do some research, if we try and be responsible. But I think your point is that while it's debatable, there is clear suffering in animals. We should at the very least be worried about suffering of animals where we can clearly see suffering. The tenuous cases are maybe debatable. And those tend to be the animals that we eat. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a key point. And so I want to go through some of the arguments chapter by chapter, more or less, not quite chapter by chapter in your book. And then I do want to again raise some philosophical questions, perhaps, or things that came to my mind. But the first version of suffering, I was just most shocked about, I guess. I mean, factory farming, I think I knew about because we talked about it a lot when we had our dialogue in Phoenix, and I was kind of aware, but I'm always amazed at the level that we cause suffering. But the one thing that really surprised me was animal experimentation, was namely, and now this will get a whole new set of people angry with me, but the facile nature of most of these psychology experiments. I was shocked. I'm not a psychologist, but doesn't seem to me you have to have a PhD in psychology to see that the kind of ridiculous tortures that are applied to animals are both not only unnecessary, but they are torture, and that they're not going to give any insight into humans, which is what they're intended to do. I mean, when you describe the way that a wide variety of animals, from dogs to monkeys to other animals, are literally tortured and confined and remove and not allowed to have stimuli to see if it's going to in any way reproduce the emotional disturbances that humans have, without realizing that the emotional disturbances that humans have is intimately related to our ability to communicate in our society and our conscience. But doing that just seems like it reminded me of Nazi experiments. I mean, I just couldn't see the difference between them. Am I missing something?
No, I don't really think you are missing something, unfortunately. And I do think that these, even if you didn't care about the animal suffering, you should think that they're basically a waste of public funds that is going into this work. And the description of them as torture is in many cases appropriate too, because what they're trying to do, for example, and I describe in the book, let me say in the first edition, I described a series of experiments that were trying to produce what was called learned helplessness in animals, to and give them inescapable electric shocks until they became helpless and passively accepted the shock. And that was in some way supposed to give us an opportunity to learn something about depression in humans. And that went on since the 1950s or something, and obviously hasn't helped us to overcome depression. It's caused an immense amount of suffering. After a while, the experimenters, some of them acknowledged this, that this is not helping us to learn about depression. And you want to think, well, then they stopped. But actually what happened is that line of experiments switched into looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes. Now, if you're going to try to study that in animals, obviously you have to give them traumatic stress in order to create this PTSD, and then, maybe hope that you'll somehow learn something about treating that in humans. But, so that's where the torture comes in. We've got to give this animal such a traumatic experience that it's going to somehow mimic PTSD in humans. But that's a terrible thing in itself, and I won't describe now, but people can read the book to see exactly how they try to do it.
Just unbelievable. One say, I mean, just you can't help but what mind came up with some of these things. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, that's right. But so in the end, it doesn't help, because as you just said, that obviously has a lot to do with the way we see the world and the way we relate. And
well, I can't understand. I mean, I would never suggest that you give humans traumatic stress, but the point is there are a lot of humans with PTSD, and you'd think the way to try and understand it would be to study them as humans.
That would be a much better use of our tax dollars. Absolutely, no question about that.
Now, so that's the sort of low-hanging fruit, the obvious examples of animal experimentation, and of course the awful experimentation that was done on animals for the perfume and other industry, which that's a low-hanging fruit. But I do, and so people should read the book up to see some of this, because it is surprising, even if you've heard some of it. But you have argued that animal testing is not always bad, or at least in principle is not always bad if there are clear benefits for, say, humans. So I want you to at least elaborate on that, because it appears contradictory. I don't think it is necessarily, but it appears contradictory. So I wanted you to
well, let me just slightly modify what you said. I don't think that experiments are necessarily justified merely by the fact that they have clear benefits for humans. The benefits for humans, or let's say, since we're never certain when we do experiments whether there will be benefits, so let's say the expected value of the benefits for humans, that is the benefits discounted by the odds that we won't achieve those benefits, has to be greater than the expected negative value for animals, based on this principle that we talked about before of equal consideration of interests. So since it's pretty certain that the animals will suffer pain, the expected value is basically the value of, or the disvalue of the pain and suffering that is going to be inflicted on them. So if there is significant pain and suffering, there has to be either a reasonably high probability of a benefit for humans, or the benefit has to be very large for a lot of humans. And if that is the case, and we are genuinely applying this principle of equal consideration of interests, and we are doing everything we can to avoid inflicting suffering on animals, including looking for alternatives that don't use animals, and increasingly more alternatives are being developed in various ways. And if we are using animals to minimize their suffering, both in the experiment itself and in terms of how they're housed, because that's another low-hanging fruit, the close confinement and miserable housing of many animals.
I want to talk about each of those in detail.
Right, yeah. But again, as a consequentialist, as a utilitarian, I can't say it's always wrong to harm an animal, no matter how great the benefit. That would be just like saying it's always wrong to tell a lie, no matter how great the benefit. So I don't believe that, but I do believe that you need to be as impartial as you can in counting the interests of the animals against the possible benefits to humans. And that's just not done in the present system, right? There is no equal consideration of interest for animals.
But without speciesism, then, the same argument, I think, could be applied to experimenting on humans, right?
Well, it could be.
I mean, on infants, say,
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
if you tried to do it on normal humans, then I guess there would be the factor that this would become known, and we would all be fearful that
Yeah.
humans were being, I don't know how it was happening. Maybe they were going into hospital and then they were getting sent off to the labs, and so we wouldn't go into hospital and we would die at a much greater rate, or maybe they were being kidnapped as they crossed parks, and so parks would be empty. So obviously for normal, aware humans, I think that would not be a good practice. But yes, you could consider it maybe for humans not capable of understanding such things. You mentioned infants, but infants generally will be loved by their parents who will understand it. So you're not going to find many. Now, you might say, well, there could be abandoned, orphaned infants, or abandoned, orphaned, profoundly retarded, profoundly intellectually disabled humans. Experiments.
But even then, I mean, I don't want to labor this because we can get near the end. I mean, some people object to the rational arguments you've given that regarding infants and maybe people in latter stages who are comatose. But one could say, yeah, well, the infants have parents and they'll extremely suffer, or older people who are comatose, who you might want to say harvest their organs for people to save people's lives, and their families will be negatively impacted. But you might say that's the pain and suffering. That's the marginal cost. But can you save more? Are you helping more people in the process? And I think you have to at least ask that question.
Yeah, you might. And of course, people do leave their bodies for dissection to help train medical students and so on.
But that's after they're dead, not before they're dead.
Right. But you could, I would certainly be equally prepared to say, and should I ever be irreversibly comatose, not dead, not necessarily brain dead as that is defined, which is another issue, but just should it be somebody scans my brain and it's clear that I can never recover consciousness. You could use my body for research that might be more valuable than research on animals, because I am, after all, a member of the species that you're trying to benefit.
Yeah, no, I have to agree with you there. And well, maybe we'll get to that near the end. I mean, I brought my mother here when she's 100 and she died in the house, and I have very strong feelings about the efforts that were made for no reason whatsoever to keep her alive in my house, and that were very difficult. Anyway, we'll see if they get there. But I wanted to hit that philosophical question. It's a deep question, and it's going to cause some people anguish that we even had that discussion. But nevertheless, that's the point, I think, is to get people thinking about these questions. But I do want to now go to the factory farming, which some people may not be aware of. I mean, I think if I just was with a young man, and and he who can't understand why don't we eat meat, and basically said he was going to eat more meat because I was arguing with him, but people should be aware. It's not that that farms are happy, nice places all the time, and that at least in the West, in the first world, most agriculture is factory farming, and in the process of that, there is incredible suffering. So why don't we? I don't want to belabor this for the long time, but why don't we spend a little time with each of the animals? Let's talk about chickens.
Okay. So if we're talking about chickens raised for meat, one of the big problems is that they are bred to grow extremely fast. They get to the weight at which they're sold in about half the time or less from traditional chicken raising. Now, what's wrong with that? One thing that's wrong is that their leg bones are not maturing fast enough and not strong enough really to hold their weight. So experts who looked at their welfare, particularly Professor Webster, who founded a Centre for Farmed Animal Welfare in Bristol in England, says that for the last couple of weeks of their lives, it's like forcing someone with arthritis to stand all day because they're in pain from bearing their weight. You might ask, well, why don't they sit down? There's a reason for that too. They're reared in very crowded sheds, and their droppings have fallen onto the floor, mixed with a litter that's there. and it's not even cleaned out between each flock of birds. They're only 6 or 7 weeks old when they're sold. And if you have a moist atmosphere with a lot of bird droppings, that forms a caustic solution. So if they sit on the litter, they actually get caustic burns, alkaline burns on their thighs and their breasts, and that's painful to them. So they don't sit for long periods. Now, there's a second aspect of this growing so fast, or being bred to grow so fast, that is just, something that people never think about, and it just shows what the whole system is like. The parents of these birds also have to have huge appetites and grow very fast. But if you gave them as much as they want to eat as you give the young chickens, they would be so fat when they were sexually mature that they would never be able to mate. The male just could not get to the right place on the female from this, fat body that he would have. So to do that, to get them sexually mature and survive, you have to starve them, basically. Standard thing is you skip a day feed. You feed them only every second day. And these are birds bred to have great appetites. Mm. So every second day, they're really hungry, looking for more food everywhere. And that's just, that's just something the factory farmers, industrial farmers would do. That's the way to produce chicken cheaply.
And the fact that I guess the other thing that I comes to mind for me is that they're constrained in such small spaces. They can't turn around. They can't.
These are the egg-laying hens now, right? I was talking
about.
It's the egg-laying ones who are, again.
Who are really constrained, the egg-laying ones. And so you talk about eggs, because I do eat eggs. So
right.
But I always eat eggs that say free range.
You should have, in Canada there and Prince Edward Island, you should have access to good free-range eggs.
Yeah.
They will not come from hens who are kept in cages. They will come from hens who not only are cage-free, which is a label widely used in the United States, but can still be a very crowded system, although not in small cages. But free range should mean that they're able to go outside, at least in suitable weather, and range around, peck in the grass, chase butterflies or whatever. And that isn't a bad life, So if you have that, then you could say, well, that's a reasonable deal. The bird gets a decent life, a shorter life than a hen would normally have, because once the rate of lay drops off, they'll send the hen to be slaughtered. But it's not too bad a life.
So it's okay to eat those free range eggs, is that right?
I think so. I must say, I don't know what the conditions are like in winter in Canada, right? In Australia, they can be out all year round, but probably not where you are. But look, it's a lot better. So
it's an interesting question, because I've thought about that. Okay, on pigs now, who are extremely smart. Let's start saying that. And what happens to them? So why don't you mention pigs? What?
Sure. Well, pigs are also standardly kept inside. They never go outside at all in their lives. They're very crowded. But the worst problems are for the mother pigs, the breeding sows, who are still commonly kept, this is in the United States, certainly commonly kept in individual stalls, where they can't turn around. They have nothing to do all day except stand up and lie down, and for a little while they get some food, which they eat quickly. And like the chickens, the breeding chickens I was talking about, they too have to be kept fairly hungry, because if you fed them as much as they have an appetite to eat, because their offspring also should put on weight as fast as possible, they would also get too fat. They're also likely to be hungry, as well as being very restricted in their movement.
I was right. They're also bred to be, they become very fat so much quicker than pigs in the wild would be, or isn't that the case?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's true of the ones who do get sent for market. Yeah, even though they're killed fairly young. But they still are already quite large and fat. It's the parent pigs who have more health problems with the way they're bred and their appetite. And they often become lame too, because their legs don't really support their weight again.
And the behavior also, my understanding is that, we think of pigs as filthy in these things, but in fact that that if they're sort of, I don't know whether you want to call it wild, but if they're not that kind of behavior is not observed, right?
No, so if pigs are naturally forest animals, and if you leave them in the forest, they're quite clean. They'll have a dunging area which is away from where they sleep, and the sow will build a nest with twigs and leaves before she has her piglets, and she'll keep that clean as well. So yeah, no, it's only when they're kept confined that they become filthy. And it's true in the factory farms, they're quite often kept on slats, on metal slatted floors, which are hosed down. So then they're not filthy, but they're also not comfortable because they're just lying on this. They're not given any straw or bedding because that has to be changed, and that costs money and labor. So they're just on bare concrete or slats.
Cows.
Well, cows, particularly the dairy industry, the real problem there that people often, again, don't see is that a cow will only give milk if she's had a calf within a certain period, let's say roughly a year. So you have to make cows pregnant each year if they're to continue to give milk. And of course, cows are mammals, and there's a close bond between the mother and her calf. And to take the calf away from the mother causes her prolonged distress. And dairy farmers will tell you that if the cows were in a particular spot, usually now these cows are intensive and they're not moving around. But in more traditional farms, if the cows would walk past the spot where their calf was taken from them, even weeks or months ago, some of them would still stop and look around and call for their calf because they would remember that was where they lost their calf. And the fate of the calf isn't good either, of course.
Yeah, especially the ones that for veal. But I want to ask about this for personal reasons because I'm surrounded, I think, by a lot of dairy farms, and I actually like I drive by and I see all these cows in the field during the day, and when I come by at night, I see them all cows coming in from the field and lining up into the well lit area and then at night I see them all kind of lined up there, and it just sort of it looks like a nice life, and I don't know if it's just because I live in PEI but on the other hand, I was also surprised. A neighbor of mine was a dairy farmer, and he's gone to Africa to try and help them improve the output of their cows for milk and stuff. And I think and it surprised me because he said here they get like 40 liters per cow or something, immense number. So you'd think it'd be the kind of factory farming that would be bad, but I don't see it. So I don't know. Am I missing something or
I don't want to comment on the cows in Prince Edward Island because I don't really know anything about them, whether the productivity is because they're given supplemental rations or because of the way they're bred. I honestly don't know. But the majority of milk produced in affluent countries is not from cows that are grazing in fields. It's intensive. I mean, the public came to realize that over the summer this year. I don't know if you read, there was a barn fire in Texas. Barn is a bit of an inverted commas word here, which killed 18,000 cows, right? So there were 18,000 cows that were locked up in this barn. And that, they weren't going out, you can't have fields for 18,000 cows. They won't get fast. They were intensively farmed. That's where they were kept. And then food was brought to them. So they were not moving around. They were not out there grazing. And, that's the way of big milk production, unfortunately, in a lot of countries.
And keeping, I suppose one could say the cow, as you say, that keeping the cows pregnant and moving the calves is we'll get to that. I want to talk about companion animals later on, but yeah. I mean, I have to say I don't, because of lactose reasons, I have soy milk or oat milk anyway, but so I feel better all around when I see the cows. What?
Yeah. There are plenty of non-dairy alternatives too.
Yeah. The thing that was, again, hits home for me and a little bit of surprise, well, not quite surprised, because my wife was actually worked on big fishing boats when she was going through college. But fish, again, I have been a pescatarian in that sense of eating fish and not meat. And it's an issue that I'm grappling with. And certainly we cause incredible distress I mean, the fish that are picked up in nets and just basically suffocate or are crushed. I mean, huge. I mean, these are factory fishing boats. These are not, you know, and but why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because I didn't realize the numbers are like trillions.
Well, it's really hard to know because the statistics are kept in tons rather than individual animals. But the best estimate that I've seen suggests that the number of fish caught and killed each year is something between 1 and 2.7 trillion fish, which is just a completely mind-boggling number, of course. And there is basically no humane slaughter for them. So they are suffering in various ways, depending whether they're, as you said, hauled up in nets or whether they're caught on long lines, lines kilometers long with thousands of hooks on them. That's pretty bad. And for the sustainability of the oceans, it's obviously very bad. But there is also intensive fish production. And, when, for example, if people buy salmon, 70% of salmon is now farmed salmon, not free-caught salmon. And the problem with that is that, well, there are a number of problems. One is that the salmon who would normally travel across the ocean famously and then swim upstream to spawn are confined in nets going round and round in circles. Secondly, salmon are carnivorous fish. So to feed these salmon, it's like factory farming is when I said it's a waste of food value. This is actually a waste of fish because somebody did a study of salmon. Salmon takes about 3 years to grow to market weight, around 4 kilos. And the salmon, by the time they're being killed, has been responsible for consuming 147 fish, caught from the oceans generally, low-value fish, ground up and made into pellets. So it's a huge amount of suffering, not just the suffering of the salmon you're eating, but the suffering of the fish who went into that salmon and the impact on the ocean of all of that catching of fish.
And I suppose the lost I mean, the fact that as with cows, as you talk about, the number of calories and protein out versus in is always a small fraction less than 1.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. It's not at all an effective way of producing food, and sometimes actually it takes food from poor people because trawlers serving the affluent world are just off the coastal limits of, let's say, countries in West Africa, and so some of those people can no longer get fish because they were fishing villages that the fish just aren't there, and that's partly responsible for the African migrants who are desperately trying to get into Europe because they can't sustain themselves where they grew up.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So it's a matter of okay. So and you make that point often is that even if you're thinking things are done for the benefit of humans to the extent that they often have quite the opposite effect. And one of the effects, which you talk about, and I want to talk about because again I've heard mixed. I've studied this a lot because my last book was about climate change. One of the negative effects of eating animals is related to climate change. So
yeah, absolutely.
And so it's one of these things where you think you're benefiting humans, but in the long run, humans may suffer because of it. Now, I think that it's unambiguous that it's better for the environment and better for climate change not to eat not to breed mass amounts of animals for meat. But I am wary of some of the comparisons that are often made by saying, well, if you just gave up eating meat, we'd get this much, we'd save this many tons of carbon or this many. And one of the arguments is, again, okay, you're taking protein and calories that could be used to feed humans, and sometimes in the ratio of 40 or 100 to 1, you're centralizing them and concentrating them in a meat animal, when in fact you could have just used all that protein and calories to feed human beings anyway. And so you're actually sort of wasting resources, and those resources that are being wasted are also contributing to climate change. But but I want to, and so you talk about that cogently in the book, and I don't know if you want to add anything to what I've just said before I get to
No, I think you
potentially.
said it very well.
Okay. But there is the issue that, okay, you can't, I'm wary when people say, if you just turned over this to that, you gain this much. And I think that that's unrealistic because, of course, you'd end up having, if you stopped eating meat, you'd end up still having to have, at least in the Western world, a kind of factory agriculture that would be producing these calories and protein that would in one way or another, if you're using more land than you were using before, then you'll be producing more carbon.
Well, sorry, but I don't see why you're using more land, because we're using so much land to feed to these animals, which, as you just said, is shrinking the amount of food available. So I think we'd be using less land.
Well, yeah. Let me go to the third world in the case where there's land and then there's arable land. So the question is, would there be? So you have to get calorie. I mean, take those people fishing off the coast of Africa. That's a concentrated protein that they can get because they presumably don't have enough arable land per person to sustain themselves, right? And so there's lots of arable land in North America and in other places around the world, but there are parts of the world where there isn't sufficient land, if you could have it, to support local population sustainably without many other resources, and fishing is one example of that. But there's also the question of sort of buying cattle that are produced elsewhere or animals that are produced elsewhere that you haven't raised locally. And so there are these hairy issues at the edge that I wonder whether I've read. I guess I wanted to ask you, I've read numbers for as far as the impact of climate change of, say, a world stopping eating meat, flesh. I've read factors of 2 to 5 reduction in carbon to as low as 5%. Bill Gates actually in his book, I think, tried to do a really realistic. Have you looked at Bill Gates's book on this or no?
No, I don't know that.
I mean, it's a much better book than I thought it'd be, trying to basically doing a reasonable calculation of the kind of economic cost benefit analysis of doing certain things. Like, as I say, obviously meat production is carbon intensive and wasteful and bad for the environment in every way, but what realistically would be required to sort of turn that around? So I just didn't know if I am wary about statements that it would dramatically cut human carbon production, which I've read in some of the literature, if we went to a vegetarian diet. But I think the case is still open a little bit, and I didn't know if you.
Well, I think it's agreed that it would cut it, and you're right. The question is how dramatically it would cut it, but and it also depends on the time frame that we're talking about, because the greenhouse gas that is produced by most animals, especially the ruminants, is methane.
Yeah.
And methane breaks down faster than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what most people do is they calculate how much worse methane is than carbon dioxide over a century. And the answer they get to that is something like 27 times. But we don't have a century to cut our greenhouse gas emissions and save the planet from catastrophe. We maybe have 20 years. And if you talk about the relative impact of methane to carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, then it's something like almost 5 times as much. It's close to 100, I think. It's like 80 times as much. So when you put that into it, then you do get a much more dramatic.
You get a much more dramatic number. Again, having thought about this, and I try to balance, because as I say, I wrote a book about climate change, but I'm not sure catastrophe is 20 years away. Catastrophe may be 20 years away for so many reasons, but I happen to think the catastrophe that's most likely to result from climate change is not the physical impact, not the fact that it'll be hotter in places, or the fact that sea levels are going to rise by at least 1/4 of a meter or 1/2 meter before the end of the century. I'd say the end of the century is more realistic argument for when there'll be serious impacts on human population, especially in coastal areas. I happen to think the bigger threat is the socio-political impact, namely the multiplier effect that you'll have climate refugees, and that's going to produce socio-political problems like it did in Sudan, and that's going to produce wars, and we have nuclear weapons, and so I'm wary about saying that. I'm not. I think climate change alone, physical climate change, in 20 years will make certain places on the earth uninhabitable. I suspect that are almost uninhabitable now, but I'm not sure it's fair to say that.
It's not only what the world will be like in 20 years, it's whether we have more than 20 years to prevent what it's going to be like in 50 or 80 years.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think in that sense, I may be more of an optimist. I'm not sure we have any time left in that sense, but I'm also an optimist about technology, and there are technologies that might, we can make projections assuming current trends, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but they're all, not that I think it's that realistic to have carbon capture. I don't know any good, and I've been in Iceland and visited a carbon capture facility there, and I worked with people at my old university in trying to develop cheaper ways of carbon capture. But even the cheapest is $100 per ton, which means when you're talking about when you're talking about gigatons of carbon, it is economically prohibitive at present. But technology, technology may help in various ways. I happen to think we're most likely going to be led to geoengineering, for better or worse. And I don't know, but I'm willing to at least be open to the fact that there are things I don't know that we may be able to do, at least ameliorate those effects in this century. But that doesn't mean that's not an argument to stop worrying about carbon. It just gives us a longer time to be able to do the right thing, maybe.
But it's also not an argument, presumably, against reducing the risk of really bad things happening.
Exactly.
When we can do that relatively easily. And
I think that comes back to your argument about in some sense, effective altruism, the calculation of marginal costs. Yes, I think I said in my book, it reminds me of those, you maybe never watched those Dirty Harry movies with Clint Eastwood, but he used to point a gun at the guy, the gun may have one bullet in it, and he said, "You feeling lucky, punk?" And ultimately, we have to say to ourselves as a civilization, well, these worst scenarios, or really disaster scenarios, may not be the case. But the risk, you have to balance risk off impact and ask are you willing to risk it? Are you willing to risk that it's not going to happen?
That is the problem.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to get through. I don't want to keep you too long, but let's go to the standard objections, which I think it's worth you talking about. Two of them that I can think of. One that I used to give to a friend of mine, an Indian friend of mine, a colleague, a physicist, when I used to say why I ate meat, I said, well, those cows wouldn't be around if I wasn't eating them. That's the first one. And the second one is animals kill other animals, so why should we kill animals? The floor is yours.
Let's deal with the second one first, because it's easier. Actually, I think it's a really bad argument. We don't take moral lessons from what other animals do. Other animals may do a whole range of bad things.
Yeah.
This is almost the argument that, well, it's natural, so it's good. And, nobody really thinks that everything natural is good.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's a serious argument at all. The other one is a serious argument, assuming that the animals are having good lives, right? The other one is, it's no argument at all for factory farmed animals to say they wouldn't exist if we weren't going to eat them, because then you just say yes, and that would be better if they didn't exist than if they had those miserable lives. But for the free-range hens maybe that are laying the eggs that you're talking about, I think you could argue that their lives are worth living. And you could argue that if there were no customers for the eggs, they wouldn't exist. And so then the question is it okay to have a system which is harming these animals in the sense of killing them at the end of their lives, or in the case of the hens at the end of their laying, when they're no longer laying as many eggs? Is that justified? Because there'll then be another animal not yet existing who will come into existence. And that is a really interesting philosophical question. It's related to questions that were developed by Derek Parfit, who was an Oxford philosopher who died 6 years ago, who I knew well, and regard as one of the most brilliant philosophers I've ever met, and he discussed it in terms of human population. So you can ask similar questions about: is it better to have a larger human population if the total happiness on this planet is then greater, even if the average level of happiness is lower, right? Because the total is greater. And that's something that philosophers are still discussing, and all sorts of views are put up to try to find a coherent answer in that and a lot of other situations that Parfit developed in his work. So it's relevant to questions about creating more lives, if they're good lives, as against causing some harm to existing beings. And that's why I say it's a good argument, in the sense that it's an argument that I do not claim I can clearly refute, because if I could, I would have to have a solution to the population problems that Parfit raised, and I and a few hundred other philosophers, many of whom I really admire, have not yet come up with a solution to that problem. So, then there's
I think you mentioned, though, something did resonate with me, which is it's hard to argue about the lives of hypothetical beings versus beings that are around. So, for example, if we didn't eat meat, we have a lot fewer cows, but the fewer cows we'd have would live better lives if we had cows. And yes. So why should we argue about all the hypothetical cows that would be?
Yeah, I mean, one philosopher once said, the question is, should we be making people happy, or should we be making happy people? And most people, when you put that to them that way, will say, well, we should be making people happy. We're not in the business of trying to manufacture happy people. But, this is something effective altruists talk to also. Would it be a really bad thing if our species became extinct? Of course, it would be bad in that we all died, but would it be bad in the way they think, that then there would not be untold vast numbers of humans living in millions of years in the future who we can reasonably hope might have very good lives? So, I don't find that I have a clear-cut answer to these questions. And that's why I would say, if in fact the animals that you're consuming really have had positive lives, if you can really be confident of that, and you prefer to keep eating them, and putting aside the climate change issues and the waste of food that's involved, let's assume that it's not a waste of food because they're grazing on grassland that is not arable land. Then it's hard for me to say clearly, yes, this is wrong and this is why it's wrong. So
okay, in fact, you did say that. You said you can't. Yeah, in fact, I didn't remember it, but you said it elsewhere. If farmed animals if farms give animals really good lives and they humanely kill them, then I don't say that killing them, is wrong. It's the suffering that's wrong. So, in that regard, there was something I read later on in the book when you talk about how people are concerned about protecting animals. By the way, just so you know, I want to go maybe 15 more minutes, because if you can do it, okay. I know I'm pushing you to the limit. I'm making you suffer, but it's for the benefit of humankind.
Okay.
Your suffering
I'll struggle through it in that case.
Yeah, but, I've thought about this, and the effect of altruism. It's worth it, I hope. But you argue that sometimes people say we should be helping animals, and we're not. And you say the American ecologist Aldo Leopold, once a keen hunter of wolves, later came to see that eliminating wolves leads to an increase in deer population, which in turn causes the deer to overgraze the habitat, resulting in the loss of other species. Eventually, the population of deer will be controlled by their food supply, and when that runs out, they'll starve to death, a slower and often more distressing death than being killed by a wolf. Well, that's true for wolves and deer, but presumably the same thing is true for hunters or culling animals, culling kangaroos in Australia, or culling deer. The same argument is that it's better to be shot by a hunter than to starve to death. How do you argue about that?
Well, I agree with the fact that it's better to be shot by a hunter than starve to death. The question is, would you have starved to death otherwise? But let's say where I am now, I'm in Princeton, and there are deer around Princeton, and the natural predators of those deer have been eliminated, whether it was wolves or First Nation humans, and so the main population control on the deer population is starving to death in winter. So yeah, I don't really object to the deer being shot. I think they ought to be shot only by people who can really demonstrate that they are expert shots who can kill the deer instantly and have strong hunting ethics. But in that case, for a limited number of deer to be shot so that there won't be starvation in the population in winter, I can understand that.
Okay, good. I want to just go through 4 or 5 sort of deep ethical questions, quick answer ones though, which came to my mind. I think they're quick answer. Maybe 3 or 4 anyway. I didn't realize you quoted Churchill. Maybe it was from the book, but I don't think so. Saying 50 years, something like the future in 50 years or something like that, where he said what a waste it is to produce a whole animal just to have the breast and legs. And you argued if he was talking 100 years hence, he might have been accurate. You're talking about lab produced meat, which you think is a good thing. I'm intrigued by the idea, but I'm also skeptical in the sense that one's thinking, if you're thinking about feeding a few hundred people or a few thousand people or a few million people, it's one thing. But if you're really thinking of replacing, say, factory farming with lab produced meat, I'm assuming it's going to be an incredibly intense, energy intensive, high tech business that's not only going to be costly, but very carbon intensive. And it's also probably going to benefit only probably wealthy countries and not poor countries. So it sounds like a good idea, but I'm skeptical that it will ultimately be a good idea. What do you think about that?
I think those are entirely empirical questions, and I agree that it would not be a good idea if it remains expensive and if it is energy intensive. But the studies that I've seen, there was one country study, show that it will be far lower in greenhouse gas emissions than meat production is. What is the real question is, can the price come down enough to actually replace factory farming? I don't think anybody knows that yet, but there are hundreds of millions of dollars in investment going into it. So, maybe we'll find out, or
well, I certainly have great faith in technology in the sense that what's expensive now won't be. I mean, if anything, as an example, from computer memory to anything else, the technology tends to always bring the price down. But I just don't know, and it'll be intriguing to see. Of course, it'll be all depend on the salesmanship, whether it's attractive to people to have meat that's been produced in the lab. Here's another one that hits home in a sense. You don't talk about companion animals in the book at all, and I don't know your view on having companion animals. I know that you have the view that you do say one thing, which is true, and I know my brother happens to breed dogs. I've often hits me about this, is that taking the little puppies away at 8 weeks. So I couldn't do it, but that you're concerned that causes suffering for the mother, and that may be the case. But what about companion animals, or if you go get a companion animal from a shelter or whatever? Do you have any pets?
I don't, but we did adopt a stray cat when our children were small and they wanted to have a companion animal. I mean, I don't have any, in principle, objections to companion animals, especially if they're adopted.
Well, the interesting thing, you said cats. You're from Australia, and I was going to say Australians hate cats.
No, that's not true.
Well, I mean, I always hear about how bad they are for the birds, and we have a cat sleeping right next to me right now that came from Australia with us.
All right, really? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think people who have cats should not let them out, especially not at night, and put bells on them, because they are killers. There's no question about that.
But what about the fact that, of course, the animals like cats are carnivorous, so you have to feed them meat of some sort? And
yes, that was a big problem. Yeah, it is very hard to. I mean, I've been told that there are foods that cats will eat and that will nourish them adequately, but I think it's difficult. So I hope that such foods will become available, but it's a problem with having cats.
When you had a cat presumably when you were a vegetarian already, but you fed the cat meat. But I assume you fed the cat meat.
We did, yeah. We fed meat or fish generally. Actually, I did experiment. I got some. I found some advertisement of some company that made a powder that you were supposed to be able to add to tofu, and the cat would eat it, and it would be nutritionally adequate. But our cat did not like it, I have to say.
Yeah, our cat. Yeah, I mean, unlike my dog, I have two dogs, but the cat doesn't knows very well what it likes, and it doesn't like things other than meat and fish. Okay, here's maybe I don't know if it's the deepest one, the hardest one. The others are pretty simple, perhaps, but I tried hard to think of a speciesist argument that might resonate with me. And you point out at the end of the book, maybe this isn't the one that's going to stump you, so don't worry about it. But you said maybe someday someone will come up with some argument that'll suggest it. But here's the argument that I can think of that suggests to me that human suffering is qualitatively different than animal suffering in a way that suggests that maybe equal consideration might be at least moderated. And that is the awareness that things could be different. The chickens that are confined to these cages, which are reprehensible, have a life that is miserable, in which they suffer. But as far as I can imagine at this point, they're not aware that it could be any different. Okay? If I did that to humans, their suffering would be multiplied by a huge factor, by the fact that they're aware that they don't have to be confined, that they could be roaming, that they could have a better life. And therefore, that leads to in some sense, I would argue, is maybe an empirical argument that there maybe equal consideration should be modulated. What do you have to say about that?
There is an empirical question about what they experience, but I don't think would lead to modulating the principle of equal consideration of interests. It would lead to say humans have a greater interest in, let's say, not being confined or caged or imprisoned than chickens do, because they have an awareness that things could be different. And let's say the chickens don't. I mean, in the case of laying hens, it's actually not clear that they don't, because until they're ready, old enough to lay, they actually can walk around. They're still inside.
I'm just thinking one, not the laying hens, the one that sort of just made for meat.
Right. Okay. So then it would be a matter of saying it's worse for humans, but that's saying humans have a different interest, because the distress that the chickens feel, let's say the pain they have in their legs because their bodies are too heavy for their immature leg bones. If, and this wasn't my parallel, if Professor Webster said this is like somebody with arthritis standing up, well, okay, perhaps he should have said it's like it, except that they don't visualize something different, and the person with arthritis remembers before they had arthritis.
Yeah.
So yes, it's worse, but there's still the physical pain.
Yeah.
If the physical pain you could suffer, even if you had that kind of pain all your life, or didn't remember that you'd not had it earlier, and that would be true for the meat chickens as well, incidentally. So there's still some pain. So I think what you modulate is the extent to which the pain is the same as the pain a human would feel standing up with arthritis all day, and that may be true. But I still don't think that the pain of the chicken is so slight that it's going to justify us in preferring to have a meal of chicken rather than a meal of some plant-based alternative.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I just want to throw that out. Okay, two last little bits, and then what, you come out saying that bad things about wool, and I was shocked about that, because having been in New Zealand and other places, I've seen sheep that haven't been sheared, they can't walk because they're like now so heavy that they can't even move, and they've been discovered, they've been lost. In what sense is wool? I would have thought wool is a perfect example of a symbiotic relationship where humans shear the sheep to keep them comfortable and utilize the products of that for, warmth and other things. What am I missing?
You're missing the fact that this is a commercial production and people are doing it to make money. So, for example, I was in Australia, in the country just back a month or two ago, and this is winter, right? Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
There were newly shorn lambs out in the fields.
Okay.
Why? Because that way they shear them twice a year. They get more wool off them than if they waited until the weather warmed up before shearing them. Then they'll only be able to shear them once a year. So it's all profit maximization, and I doubt that it's any different in New Zealand than it is in Australia.
Or Patagonia, maybe. I'm not sure. Okay, so the idea is that it's factory. It's not in principle, it's in the practice, basically.
Yes, that's right. In principle, you could have sheep having idyllic conditions. You would shear them, and you would shear them gently. That doesn't really happen necessarily either. But you would shear them gently and take your time so that they didn't get cut or distressed.
Yeah.
And you would only shear them at the time when they didn't need the wool. Okay.
2 last questions. One, a trivial one. In almost every area you talk about, the U.S. is behind Europe and the rest of the world. Why? Is it because of agribusiness? It just seems to be universal that when it comes to rights, these issues of humane treatment of animals, in particular, the U.S. seems to be behind Europe, Australia, the rest of the world.
It's because of the corrupted United States political system. Agribusiness is one of the corrupting players, but it's the fact that money plays a bigger role in general in US politics than it does either in Europe or Australia, and probably in Canada too, because I think parliamentary democracies generally work better than the US system. And my evidence for that is that whenever you can put a vote before the public, as in those states that have citizen-initiated referendum, like California, you get over 60% of Americans voting against factory farming. And that's happened on a number of occasions. But if you try to get it through either the federal Congress, or even fail to get it through the California state legislature either, then the lobbyists take over and you don't get there.
Okay, and that related to the question I didn't ask, which is the question of preference voting and the utilitarian purpose, which seems to be so much more rational way of voting. But we'll have to leave that to another discussion. The one thing that I found profoundly I disagreed with was one sentence near the end of the book.
Wow, what was it?
76. You talked about why you don't think an appeal to sympathy and compassion alone will convince most people of the wrongness of speciesism. Even where other human beings are concerned, people are surprisingly adept at limiting their sympathies to those of their own nation or race. That I agree with. The next sentence shocked me. Almost everyone, however, is at least nominally prepared to listen to reason. I'm shocked.
Even with the word nominally.
Yeah, nominally, even with the word nominally. Do you find empirical evidence for that in the modern world?
Well, I could only say that even the people, I'm in the United States now, there's a lot of crazy people with bizarre conspiracy ideas, but they try to argue for their ideas.
But that's arguing is different than listening.
Oh, I see.
And listening to reason is something that, I spend not my whole life. I spend a lot of my life writing and have to try and argue that reason should be the guide for our behavior and for the process in which we investigate the world. And I find that people, as far as I can see, listening to reason is something. Ultimately, in order to get, I hate to say it goes back to, I guess it's Hume, right? That reason is the slave of passion. That to get people to listen to, is it Hume or I think it's Hume? I don't know.
But Hume is talking about reason in action, right?
I know. But in order to get people to listen to reason, I think you have to approach them passionately. As a teacher, I don't expect my students were interested in what I have to say. I have to convince them to be interested in what I have to say, and I have to use passion as a way of doing that. So anyway.
Okay, you're undermining your reason then if you think by using pain. You don't think you can actually persuade them by reason?
Well, I think it's a matter of assuming. I think in order to get people to listen, that's the key point.
Uh-huh.
And this is from a person who's often confused of never listening, often accused of never listening. I think you have to think about what people hear versus what you're saying, and how can you be an effective communicator? How can you? And often you have to think of a way that people will listen to what you're saying without listening to what they think you're saying. And
Right.
that's it. And anyway, it's a conundrum that as someone who spent, like me and you, who spent a lot of their life trying to communicate, in my case, science, and in your case, philosophy, and often science, it's an issue that we have to deal with all the time. So, last question, which is what can be done, and I think from an effective altruism point of view, you can say what was the most. There were two questions that your publisher sent me, and among the whole list that I found interesting, the rest were just kind of anyway. What is the most successful example of animal welfare protest, and in particular, what are the greatest strides? What one step can we do today to further the goal of ending speciesism? What the heck? Let me ask that question.
Yeah, so the most successful examples have been the use of democratic channels, particularly in the European Union, to ban from the European Union things that are still mainstream in the United States, and some of them certainly in many other countries, such as the standard cage for laying hens, the individual stalls for the breeding pigs that we talked about. We didn't talk about veal calves, but individual stalls for veal calves. So I think that's the most successful activities worldwide. What can we do? Well, we can still work with animal organizations. I think they do make progress. I think they are responsible for significant change. Look for the good ones. Now, the equivalent of the life you can save for global poverty, the equivalent of that for animals is animal charity evaluators. So go to animalcharityevaluators.org, find effective organizations, join them. And of course, you can also contribute, and you can be an example, as Richard Keshen was to me, by not eating animals yourself.
And what you didn't add it, but I'll add it for you. The other thing we can do is talk to each other, and like you do, in the extreme, because you have a bigger soapbox, as in some sense I do, but to be able to try educate each other.
Oh, absolutely,
And I guess I've always think that's ultimately the solution. So the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks a nail. But as an educator, I think ultimately.
No, but there was a survey recently I just saw posted which asked people what had led them to become a vegetarian, and number one was conversation with a friend.
Yeah, conversation with a friend, and having the tools, and that's one of the reasons. I don't want to sound like I'm an advertising, but that's the value of a book like this, and is that if you want to have useful empirical. If you don't want to just talk, but have empirical evidence as well as clear logic, which is fine, this is great, because we touched on the edges of when it comes to factory farming, for example, but the examples in here are compelling, and I think for me that was a large part of the impact in my changing probably our discussions maybe early on in changing my doctrine. It took a long while for me, but let me say that, but I'm coming there. Anyway, right. I want to. So I do want to thank you, because when we talk about what we can do most, I think it's educating others, and you do as I often say. I know you, like me, are an atheist, and like my old friend Steven Weinberg, and I always like to say that you're doing God's work. As he used to say to me, because, but I thank you very much for the time and the personal suffering that you had to go through. In this, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. I did
enjoy it, even if I was starting to get hungry and tired. But
I'm okay. Thank you so very much. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lou.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century, and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.